Hi, welcome to the Physionic podcast. My name is Nicholas Verhoeven. I'm a PhD candidate in molecular medicine. I hold my master's in exercise physiology, and I was a researcher for a number of years, in a metabolism laboratory. So I think that's the credentials I'll offer for this particular podcast. And this podcast is going to be related to metabolic flexibility. So I'm going to tell you what metabolic flexibility is. I'm going to briefly kind of go into glycolysis and oxidative phosphorylation. If those two words are scary to you, have no fear. I will break them down for you. We're not going to go into some, extreme molecular metabolic detail on any of those, but we do need to cover them because they are a massive part. They are essentially metabolic flexibility. I'm also going to give you some instances, some examples of metabolic flexibility, why metabolic flexibility is important, how to improve your metabolic flexibility, and then I'm going to put a bow on everything and have a nice, succinct conclusion for you. So if that sounds good to you, then stick around. All right, so let's go into what is metabolic flexibility. Metabolic flexibility, how many times am I going to say that? Metabolic flexibility, bear with me. The flexibility of metabolism is based on two nutrients, two substrates. I'm going to use those interchangeably. Nutrients is really more talking about what you consume, and substrate is what the actual cells are going to use, but they're kind of one and the same. They're very synonymous in that way. So the two nutrients, substrates, that we're going to be focused on is one, fat. So if you go look at a nutrition label, you see fat is listed there. That's what we're talking about. And the other one is carbohydrates, which you may have also heard as glucose and fructose. We're going to be focused on glucose in this situation, but a lot of this applies to fructose as well. So the body has the ability, and when I mean the body, I'm talking about the cells that make up your body, have the ability to switch, not all your cells, but many of your cells have the ability to switch from a more fat-focused metabolism to a more glucose or carbohydrate. Again, those are synonymous. If I say carbohydrate or if I say glucose, those are the same. Metabolism. So it can switch from fat to more glucose, or it can switch from glucose to more fat use for its metabolism. What does that actually mean, though? Well, your cells require X amount of energy to survive. Let's say we were to zoom in into a single cell of your body, and you have trillions of them, but let's just focus in on one cell. That cell would be taking up carbohydrates and fats, and it will put them through this pathway, this breakdown machinery within the cell itself, kind of like we have a digestive tract, and will break those molecules down, the fat and the carbohydrate, and will generate energy, cellular energy. We think of energy as like, oh, I'm eating my fat or I'm eating my carbohydrates. Well, your cells take that to another extreme. They go even more detailed, and they change the chemical structure, the molecular structure of the fat and the carbohydrate, and they produce a new molecule known as ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Now, there are other molecules that it also produces, like GTP, guanine triphosphate, but we're going to be focused on ATP because that is the most common one. Now, how it does that is it does that through these two particular mechanisms, these two ways of going about producing this ATP, and that is glycolysis and oxidative phosphorylation. Again, I'm not going to bog you down with all the details of what each one is, but ultimately just know that carbohydrates can go into glycolysis, and they can also end up in oxidative phosphorylation, OXPHOS. That's the shortened version of that. So the cell can either allow glycolysis to break down this carbohydrate molecule and generate ATP out of that, or it can have this carbohydrate molecule continue on and go to oxphos and generate more ATP. And the distinction of why the cell would use one or the other is dependent on the cell's situation. If it's a muscle cell, if it is in an exercise state, that's going to play a huge factor as to why. I don't really want to go too much into detail with that because that's going to really bog us down in like oxygen delivery and CO2 exhale and like a bunch of things that are unnecessary to this particular lesson or podcast. So just ultimately know that glucose, carbohydrates, can go to glycolysis and generate ATP, usually much smaller amounts of ATP, but much quicker, or can go to oxphos and generate large amounts of ATP, but as a result, it is slower. So it's a slower process. Now, on the other hand, a fatty acid, which is what I've got on the screen, if you're just listening to the podcast, a fatty acid and a fat are one and the same. So let's say a fat molecule can only go through oxidative phosphorylation. So it can only go through oxphos. Okay, great. So that is the basis for why the cells have glycolysis and they have oxidative phosphorylation. They use both. And that switch between them is metabolic flexibility, the ability for your cells to switch from glucose or carbohydrates to fats, or fats to carbohydrates. And what are some instances of this metabolic flexibility? Well, one instance is when you're sleeping. When you're sleeping, your body is using large amounts of fat. And I don't want you to run away from this thinking, well, then I just need to sleep more and I'll lose body fat. It's not, that's a larger conversation. And I'll just go ahead and cut it off right there and say, that's not going to work. Okay, so let's just get that out of the way. However, when you're sleeping, your cells switch to more oxidative phosphorylation. They use more fat. They tend not to use as much carbohydrates. And that's because you are in a completely dormant state. You're not moving much. So the need for rapid energy is not there. So it can just take its time and produce the ATP that it needs, and it's going to use the more abundant nutrient or substrate is, well, fat. We have a lot more fat on our body than we do stored carbohydrates, which is glycogen. So, or even if you were to take into account, let's say you ate a ton of carbohydrates or just a ton of food in general, what's found in your stomach. So, all right. So the point is that when you're sleeping, you're using mostly fat. On the other hand, if you were to then suddenly consume carbohydrates, or if you were to fast, let's say you wake up and you're fasting for, let's say, another 6 hours after you wake up, you're using a lot of fat. You're still using a little bit more carbohydrates because now you're awake and you're actually doing things. So your carbohydrate load increases, your dependence on carbohydrates. But then let's say you consume carbohydrates. Let's say you consume it doesn't have to be sugar. It can be bread. It can be anything, rice, whole wheat, pasta. I mean, whatever ends up being, as long as it's a carbohydrate. Then, because you have this sudden influx of carbohydrates into your bloodstream, what your cells do is they're like, without anthropomorphizing the cells too much, they essentially go, aha. I really hate having these like doing this kind of stuff because I don't want to be this like pop science channel of like oh, boys and girls. And then they thought, it's like I really want to go into the far more nitty gritty, and I will in the future, but just because I also want to educate well. I try and have more of a surface level and then kind of slowly dip deeper and deeper into the nitty gritty molecular science of this stuff. So excuse some of my terminology as some of this might be super simple for you. But the point is that the cells recognize in a way, mainly through the action of insulin, binds to the cells. Then you have this influx of carbohydrates, and now they no longer need fat. So obviously insulin is also going to stop the release of fat from the fat cells. So the fat molecules are no longer being released by the fat cells, and therefore you have a decrease in the fat that's available, but you have an increase in the carbohydrates that are available. So that's why you have that switch. Suddenly the cells start using more carbohydrates as opposed to fat because they have an availability of carbohydrates. So that makes sense. So consuming carbs would be an example of that metabolic shift. You're always going to have this shift that suddenly the cells are revving up to use more carbohydrates until the carbohydrates are spent. Let's say then you end up fasting for, let's say, 12 hours. Then as you get deeper and deeper into that fast, the body is going to start to release more fats again, more fat molecules, and therefore you have the cells that are then going to start taking up more fats and switch again from the carbohydrate metabolism to more fat-focused metabolism. Okay, another example of this is exercise intensity. Something that I sort of alluded to earlier is that if you are exercising really intensely and you feel that burning sensation, that's because you are undergoing carbohydrate style metabolism. You're going through glycolysis almost exclusively. So you're generating energy really quickly, but there's a cost to that. And I'm not going to go into the cost of like hydrogen and hydrogen buffering and all that stuff. Just the point is that there's a cost, and it's that burning sensation. You feel it. Okay, so that is an example of a carbohydrate-focused metabolism. But if, let's say, you were to run a marathon, suddenly it's kind of this interplay between the two, but mostly the cells are focused on using fat. And the better you are, the better, or the better you are at, let's say, marathon running, the more fat-focused your metabolism will be. Again, that is not to say that you will lose more body fat. That's a whole nother conversation, and it's a more nuanced discussion, just to be clear. I try to interject that because a lot of people sometimes have these these light bulb moments. Aha! I just need to switch my metabolism to more fat focused, and I'll lose more fat. That doesn't work that way. I know that sounds kind of logical, but it doesn't work that way. And I can explain that in future content if you'd like. Okay, so why is metabolic flexibility important? Better exercise performance, as I mentioned. If you're running a marathon and you don't want to bonk or you don't want to hit the wall, I forgot the exact saying, but one of my old professors used to say, fat burns in the flame of carbohydrates. I think that's roughly what he said. And what that means is that for your body to be able to continue its marathon-like performance, meaning it's moving at a pretty quick pace, obviously faster than walking. So if you're moving at a relatively quick pace, but not a sprint, obviously, because you can't do that throughout an entire marathon. If you're moving at that kind of moderate pace, then you're still going to be relying a little bit on carbohydrates. And that pace is going to be based off of the carbohydrate load. So the amount of carbohydrates that you have, that's why you hear about marathon trainees and whatnot, they consume a ton of carbohydrates a few days before their race. And that's because they're trying to super compensate. That's a whole nother discussion. Again, I realize I'm really trying to focus this on metabolic flexibility. But if you're interested in any of the things that I'm mentioning, certainly comment, let me know, and send me a message, whatever. And if I get enough of them, then yeah, I'll definitely cover that stuff for you. So anyway, the marathon performance is not based on the amount of fat that you have available, because you have kilograms and kilograms, pounds and tens of pounds of fat on you. So that's never going to be an issue in terms of like, do I have enough resources to fuel my body? No, you can move at a kind of a glacial pace for a long time days and days if you're using strictly your fat metabolism. But you're not trying to do that. You're trying to win a marathon. You're trying to go at a particular pace. So that means you have to be a little bit faster than a glacial pace. As a result, you're going to be relying a little bit on that carbohydrate metabolism. But if you run out of carbohydrates, what's left over? Only your fat, and that's the bonking. That's the cells aren't generating enough energy fast enough. So that's an example of where metabolic flexibility can be really useful, really important. Better insulin sensitivity. So being able to consume carbohydrates and have them shuttled straight into the cells, as opposed to having insensitive cells that would be incapable of having that switch from fat to blood sugar. Now, the reason why that might be an issue is because you may have elevated blood sugar. And as you know, that's pretty problematic because that is one of the initial signs of diabetes. So having that improved sensitivity of being able to consume carbohydrates, have those carbohydrates get shuttled into the bloodstream, and then for those to get sucked up into the cells and be used up as energy, putting a brake on fat. And we're not talking about fat loss at this point because we don't care about that right now. All we care about is getting those carbohydrates out of the bloodstream from an elevated level to a normal level. And the only way that that's possible is through that metabolic switch, to be able to go through glycolysis and be able to go through oxphos with carbohydrates, and for insulin to be able to bind and have that sensitivity there. So it's kind of a multifaceted approach, or an area that requires a lot of different things to integrate well. So those are a few examples of, metabolic flexibility as well as its importance. But how do you actually improve metabolic flexibility? Well, as you might have been able to guess, exercise is a huge one. If that's lifting weights, or if that's aerobic exercise or long duration exercise like running, jogging, biking, rowing, things like that are long duration, which you can do for a long time. Those actually tend to be a little bit better for improving your metabolic flexibility. If you are going to be a triathlete, especially a world-class triathlete, or if you're going to be a marathoner, or an Ironman, Ironwoman, like if you're going to be aiming for that, then this concept right here is one of the number one things you should be focused on. Because if you don't master this, then you will never be one of the best. It's just impossible. You have to actually get your cells to be so good at using fat that they rely on unbelievably low levels of carbohydrates. And that's what's going to allow you to propel forward for longer periods of time at a quicker pace, to become more efficient at the use of fat and become quicker at the use of fat. So exercise is a big one, especially long duration exercise. Becoming more insulin sensitive. So one way to do that is fat loss, right? So just losing body weight. If you are overweight and you become more normal weight, then you would be considered more insulin sensitive typically in those situations. And that will then also improve your metabolic flexibility. Also, you could make an argument for something like low carb. Not that I would necessarily say that that's the first thing that I would think of, but you could go low carb. And that way, then you'd be focused, really focused on that fat metabolism. And I would probably say overall, however, when it comes to actual performance, to get the best out of your body, you would want to employ exercise for that. Because fat adaptation, which is what I'm essentially talking about here, having that switch to fat metabolism is a lengthy process, and it's something that's really delicate, and just going low carb isn't necessarily going to make the best use out of the situation. Not to mention, if you do consume carbohydrates, you are so poorly adapted to carbohydrate metabolism that you may experience some crashes. So there are negative outcomes from low carb. I mean, while there are positive outcomes, there are also, on the flip side, more drastic negative outcomes. Is it going to kill you or anything? No, it's not at all. It's just you're going to feel really lethargic for a while until your body kind of adapts. Those cells adapt again to being able to switch really easily between low carb or between carbohydrate metabolism and fat metabolism. Excuse me. Okay, so in conclusion, let's wrap this one up. Metabolic flexibility is the ability for the cells of your body to switch their production of cellular energy, ATP, adenosine triphosphate, to and from fat to glucose or carbohydrates, and back again from carbohydrates to fat metabolism. And that is dependent on the circumstance. The greater one's metabolic flexibility, so the greater your metabolic flexibility, the better general health that you typically have, and the better overall physical fitness that you typically have. So it's something that you may want to improve, and it is something that will improve no matter what if you exercise. That's the big one. And of course, if you go from an overweight situation to a more normal weight situation, in that circumstance as well, you will experience betterment in the ability for your cells to switch from one metabolism to the other. Okay, folks, that's what I've got for you. Hopefully you found this informative, and hopefully for those that have asked me about this particular question, you know what? I just realized that I didn't use any of my graphics that I had. You can click off now if you want, but for those that were interested in actually seeing glycolysis, just as a brief, so I can kind of wrap this up, I've got a picture here where glucose is outside of the cell, and what it does is it enters the cell, and then it undergoes glycolysis where it can produce a low amount of ATP, and then if certain conditions are met, which are not things that I want to go into now, you get the production of pyruvate, and pyruvate then enters the mitochondria, or it gets used by the mitochondria to generate far more ATP. So then it's going through oxidative phosphorylation. So on the other hand, you also have fat molecules that are outside of the cell, and they enter the cell through what are called fatty acid transporters, and then they enter the mitochondria through what's called CPT, which are other transporters and proteins, really enzymes, that allow them into the mitochondria, and then in the mitochondria they undergo oxidative phosphorylation, the same as what you might get with pyruvate and glycolysis. So, and finally, the last image that I had, I just can't stop the podcast and not use these because I spent 30 minutes trying to make these. So you have fat or glucose, and I realize this might look a little convoluted, but you have a mitochondria on the top left corner, and then there's two membranes of the mitochondria. There's an outer membrane and an inner membrane, and in the inner membrane you have a bunch of proteins that are called the electron transport chain, and all those proteins they all work together to produce cellular energy, ATP, that I was talking to you about earlier. So the fat and the glucose, they're no longer fat and glucose at this point. They're other molecules, but again, I don't want to bog this down. So the fat and the glucose enter the mitochondria through after glycolysis, or from fat just through a process technically called beta oxidation, but again, not going to go into it. And it enters the mitochondria, and then they go through this process of being changed. They essentially donate certain things, electrons, to this chain, this electron transport chain, and then it spits out ATP, and then the cell can use ATP for energy to actually break those molecules and liberate energy. So there you go. I got to use my diagrams. Fantastic. And if you're listening to the podcast, you may have been a little confused if you haven't clicked off yet. And if you were watching this podcast, You're just going to have to forgive me for being a little scatterbrained today. I had a long day in lab today, but a really productive, fantastic day in lab. So I'm really happy about that. Made some really cool discoveries that hopefully in 1 to 2 years I'll be able to actually present on for my dissertation. All right. That's where I'll leave things. Thanks for stopping by. I really appreciate it. And hopefully this helped. And I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.